Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. Today is our fifth discussion with Tim session, and today Tim wants to riff off my last video on the Lex Talionis. So, go ahead, Tim.
Well, last week you had a discussion on Lex Talionis, pacifism, and Christianity. And as a sort of secular agnostic person, a lot of that stuff to a certain extent didn't make any sense. But I gave you a bit of a reading list with two thinkers that are anarchists and pacifists to some degree. One, an anarchist of the left, Noam Chomsky, and one, an anarchist of the right, Hans Hoppe. You could pick different anarchists, but I think they're both that way. And I don't think you can say that Chomsky or Hoppe are capital W warmongers either. But back to last week's episode. I think, as you discussed, that a mild version of pacifism is inevitable for any so-called Christian based on a reading of Matthew and the larger New Testament. And I think a lot of the problems that anarchists have, like the Hoppes or the Chomskyite type variety, are a lot of similar problems that Christians have, Christians of the sort of pacifist type ilk. And actually, if you look at the history of the United States, the one Anabaptist perspective video you sent, the United States is sort of founded, a lot of the ideas of liberty. They're rooted in sort of this sort of non-resistance to a certain extent. It's not entirely rooted. That's one area I disagree with you. But they're to a certain extent rooted in those ideas. But first, a mild version of pacifism is inevitable. I don't think anyone who's a Christian can go around just, pillaging people, shooting people. You steal a pencil, you go kill the person. I don't think any of that kind of absurd type stuff any so-called Christian follower can do. And that's first. Now, I think the distinction is, and this is where Noam Chomsky, the New Testament, and Hans Hoppe all actually agree on, is that just because you pick up the sword of the state, it doesn't allow you to do these things anyway. If I got into a plane and got a big bomb on it, and I took off, I could actually do this. I have a few flight lessons. I can't land it, but if I took off and flew to a residential area and dropped it, I would be a criminal. That's a criminal act. But if I put a flag on, and this is what Chomsky and Hoppe both agree on, if I put a flag that says U.S. Pentagon on it or something like that, then all of a sudden it becomes some magic trick. Then it becomes it's just an act of the state. Thus, you're vindicated. And actually, in that regard, I think all three of them agree. So this goes into the idea: can Christians serve in the state? That's one of the big things. And this is a very technical issue. I think the standard reading is no. I think the standard reading should be no. And I know that's a very hard reading. That's one of the problems with Christianity. It's very difficult. But I think the standard reading is no. And that was discussed last week. So far, what do you agree and what do you disagree about what I say?
Okay, so the first thing you said was the ethics don't change just because you're having a flag and you have the state behind you. That's actually true, because now this then begs the question on anarchist ethics: is everything that the state does intrinsically immoral? But for example, one of the things that was a common practice in antiquity, and in fact in any monarchical regime all the way up until, probably the 19th century, was if you invaded a country or you usurped the throne, you not only had to kill the king, you had to kill all of his family, because they would come back for revenge and kill you. But we read in Deuteronomy 24:16, fathers shall not be put to death for their sons, nor the sons should be put to death for their fathers. Everyone should be put to death for his own sin. That's also referring to tribal blood feuds. So if you have a blood feud where it's like, oh, you killed my brother, I'm going to kill all your family. It's like, no, the only person you're allowed to kill in the law is the guy that killed your brother. That's it. So we see here that, just because you have the mantle of authority doesn't mean you can't do these things. And also, you can't steal. So, right, when Ahab steals Naboth's vineyard by murdering Naboth, he's judged by Elisha for it. And so the Bible does create this precedent, which, again, anarchists and libertarians are implicitly referring to, that just because you have the mantle of legitimate authority doesn't give you the right to do things that are otherwise morally impermissible.
Yeah, people like Hoppe and Chomsky disagree on certain things, but I think most people, Keith Preston would probably call both of them anarchists. And as a standard of anarchism, I think that works as a heuristic. So I think most Christians in their so-called private lives, and even nominal Christians, follow the mild version of not pessimism, of a pacifism to a high degree. To a high degree. Anyone who goes to church 40 Sundays a week, they generally, number one, don't commit crimes. And this is all largely bared out in empirical data. They don't commit crimes, all these sort of things. And actually, and as we were discussing privately, things like the Hutterites have like no crime rates and stuff like that. So I think any follower of Christ to some degree follows this. But, and this is the distinction, if they put on a police uniform or go join the army, then those ethics, to sort of a certain extent, fly out the window. Do you agree on that?
That is often how it's been treated historically. So a case in point, you look at the conquistadors and their conquest of the Americas. That's as brutal as anything you'd see by the Romans or Genghis Khan. And yet these people claim to be doing it in the name of Christ and his church. I mean, when Romans and the Genghis Khan do it, well, they both worship war gods, right? Rome worships Mars and Genghis Khan worships Tengri, the great sky god. And so, okay, they worship war gods and they plunder and pillage. Okay, that makes sense. Odin too with the Vikings. But like when you're a Christian and you worship the Prince of Peace and you go rape and pillage Mexico, yeah, that doesn't really square very well, does it?
No. So I'd like some sort of definitions here. First, pacifism. As I say, to a certain extent, I think pacifism is impossible. And actually, Chomsky actually states this explicitly. If you can't defend an anarchist community, and actually Chomsky type anarchist community was not defeated by right-wingers. Well, to a certain extent it was defeated by right-wingers. But the Barcelona anarchist types, they were defeated by the Stalinists.
And the same in Russia. The Bolsheviks defeated Makhno.
Yeah. So it was a threat from the militant left that defeated the sort of pacifist left in both Barcelona and Russia. And actually, Chomsky admits this to his credit. And actually, Chomsky says if you can't defend anarchism, in his case, it's left anarchism, you can't have an anarchist community. And I think that in the same way for the Hoppian libertarians as well. But they have rights protection agencies, which that's a whole other issue we're not really going to discuss here necessarily, but do you agree with that distinction? If you can't defend your community, you can't really have it. And then how do your type of pacifistic Christians do this? And in what degrees do you agree with a person like Hoppe or Chomsky on the problems of anarchism?
Well, I mean, okay, I would disagree that you can't have a community if you don't defend it, for the very fact that we have communities that haven't defended themselves for 500 years. And let's not be glib here. When the Anabaptists came on the scene, literally everybody was genociding them. The Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Catholics. They were like born in the middle of the Holocaust, and they still survived. So literally, it's the worst possible situation you can imagine putting people of that ethical position, and they survived. Whereas the anarchists couldn't. So I think that tells you who's got a more viable libertarian society right there. Now then we can all haggle about how they actually did it. Were they free riding? Were they whatever? Even if you want to take the account that they were free riding, well, we do it better than anybody else. But that's maybe a less charitable reading of the history. But the point is, we were thrown in the middle of a Holocaust and we survived. The anarchists can't even survive, when they get betrayed by the commies. So, but let's look at your definitions. You sent me a list of 3 things you want a definition for: pacifism, violence, and conflict. Mm-hmm. So one thing that we need to get out of the gate right away is what pacifism isn't. This is an interview with Gene Sharp by James L. Van Hisse. And Gene Sharp is a famous, he's famous for his book Democracy to Dictatorship, or Dictatorship to Democracy, which is about nonviolent revolutions, most famously seen in the deposition of Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia. Sharp says, a pacifist historically is a position or doctrinal rejection of the military on moral or political grounds or whatever, primarily a personal position. It's simply, no, I will not do that. It doesn't contribute to what could be done instead. And so I identify more as someone who's concentrating on trying to refine and develop the potential of you can do instead. And that isn't pacifism as a doctrine at all. And especially since what you could do instead can be done by people who are not pacifists, but by people who would normally perhaps use violence. So there's two things here. I think Gene Sharp is correct in identifying the fact that sort of nonviolent political activism, like, say, Rosa Parks sitting in the front of the bus or trying to, protest the presidential palace of Slobodan Milosevic, is pacifism. But one of the things that you get is pacifism, both by Gene Sharp, who's probably more sympathetic to it, and critics of it, is that it's just not doing anything. And again, this sort of gets back to the fact that church history has essentially been retconned by Catholics, and then the retconning has been continued by Protestants. First of all, the idea that pacifism is doing nothing is, of course, something that the critics of pacifism say about the believer. And of course, within the Western context, with the exception of certain left-wing humanitarians, it's historically been associated with Christianity and really nothing else. Until the modern age, with certain, like I said, humanitarian leftists and libertarians who are pacifistic. And one of the things that has happened is due to this retconning of history, where most people don't take the 5 antitheses of Christ seriously or any of his teachings. They don't realize that is doing something, right? So when Paul says in Ephesians 6, we have powerful tools to tear down strongholds. That's what we're doing. For example, when you look at the rise of the early church in the Roman Empire did not arise and become so popular because people were just sitting there, twiddling their thumbs, doing nothing. When there was a famine or an earthquake, the first people there were Christians. The pagans were all flee. The ones that had enough money or were of sound body to leave would just leave. And the Christians were widely condemned as being suicidal because they'd go into a city that had an earthquake. They'd go into a city that had a plague and try to do essentially what we would call today aid relief. The first people that would do so. And these are also outsiders, not necessarily Christians themselves, Gentiles, so potential converts as probably the idea behind it. That's doing a lot of good. And of course, that concept evolves into the hospital by the 4th century. By the 4th century, with toleration of Christians, you could actually build a hospital and not worry about the Romans coming down to confiscate it like they would during the days of Nero and Domitian.
So I'll stop you a second. Can I stop you for a second? I think the free riding claim is actually a very, if anything, oftentimes pacifistic Christians are the ones who get free ride off in this case. And I think that its growth is very clear in that way. And back to my earlier point, I think most Christians actually, in their so-called private lives, even nominal Christians, follow this to some standard anyway. It's just when they become part of the state, they do differently. Because I actually agree with the anarchist libertarians. Like, you hear the right-wing anarchist libertarians type, like you say, this is a voluntary transaction. I actually think in a large degree we are to a certain extent in our private lives here in the United States ungoverned to a large extent. Not entirely. I'm not saying it in a utopian way, but you don't see general mayhem like that. And actually, never the Anabaptist perspective that you brought up, and he's not an Anabaptist, but the Wesley guy in UK, he possibly. And I have not checked the history on this. He possibly prevented a kind of class conflict that you saw in France. That Wesley is a Methodist reformer, UK, and he possibly prevented some sort of violent class conflict in UK. So in that regard, preventing a major class revolution was a huge win for the crown there and for England. So they weren't free riding at all. Would you agree?
I would agree. I want to expand on that a little bit more. For example, the Quakers, who are again, they're a bit ambiguous because while they're pacifistic, they do want to hold political office in a democratic Republican system. But they were instrumental behind the abolition of the slave trade, and also the idea of freedom of religion in the United States was, again, I won't say wholly due to the Anabaptist influences, but the Baptist Anabaptist influences were, and I think, an important countervailing force against, say, the more high church Anglicans, during the colonial era, that sort of developed this culture of freedom of conscience. In fact, we invented the idea. Nobody before had really come up with the idea that every man should believe what he's convicted of by his conscience. And the Anabaptists really put that into practice. And basically, when people say pacifism is doing nothing, what they really mean is if you don't use the power of the state to threaten to murder people, you're doing nothing. Because really, that's the alternative, right? Well, you won't, use the power of the state to tax people or to pass laws, which is essentially, a veil covering the fist that'll, punch you out if you don't do it.
Yeah, as libertarians say, and actually, maybe taxes are necessary. That's a side dispute, but as libertarians say, taxation is just, give me 10% of your whatever percent of your revenue, or else I'll throw you into a cage. I agree with that. I think that is just a veiled threat. It's just an extortion. It's not a voluntary fee or anything like that. But keep going.
What I would say is this: pacifism, or within the Christian context, is a form of resisting evil in the world that is dealing with evil at its root. So think of like the Matrix, right? Well, when I used to watch the Matrix and they'd shoot up the agents, I'm like, wait, you're actually killing a person in the real world because the agent just kind of hijacked him. And if you die in the Matrix, you die in the real world. The real root of the problem isn't the person the agent hijacked. It's the maker who made the program, who's controlling the agents. And if we use the maker as an analogy for the devil and the agents as an analogy for the demons, then we can see that Christianity is fighting at that level. And by removing those threats, if you want to translate it in a more secular way, you could say we're dealing with the negative psychology that people have. So it's like, instead of, rewarding people for being angry and poor impulse control and violent, we create a culture that encourages peaceful negotiation of issues. And so in many ways, it's basically fighting evil without using the state or without using force and coercion to fight the evil. So in that way, it does presage a lot of the best thought from libertarians and like Hoppe and anarchists like Chomsky. I think the libertarians in general are generally pretty sympathetic. I remember the famous Rothbardian retort to the anti-pacifist. He said, the anti-pacifist says, what would you do if someone tried to rape your wife and children? And Chomsky said, well, what would you do if the government drafted you in the army and told you to shoot your wife and children? And I'm like, that's a good response, Rothbard. So in that regard, I think in a nutshell, in the Christian conception, pacifism is fighting evil at the source. So we look beyond the material apparatus of the state where people, who otherwise might be moral, do things that are terrible. But we fight it at the root. So in a lot of ways, when the left looks at crime, they say, look, you got to deal with the root cause of crime to get rid of it. Well, exactly. And the root cause of crime in the Christian consensus is sin. And so by treating that, you treat the root cause of crime. So I think that this is really disingenuous when people say that. They're really saying you're not willing to use blackmail and force to get what you want. And, as a Christian, you shouldn't be using blackmail and force to get what you want. Your second definition is, what is violence? And I think, conversely, violence could just be described as using force to get what you want. And force is on a spectrum, from punching somebody to, riddling them full of, Tommy gun bullets. And on that spectrum, you're using force, or even more broadly speaking, violence is using some form of coercion, blackmail, pressure, or force to compel someone's will to match your will.
Yeah, or even worse on a state level, hydrogen bombs, carpet bombs, drones. That's on a state level, not just on an individual level, but a large level. Those are the ultimate tools of violence. Would you agree?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, everything is a veiled threat, and violence is reliant on being willing to use that. So the veiled threat itself could be seen as an act of violence, because it says, if you don't do it, like the mafia, right? I'll give you an offer you can't refuse. That is an act of violence, even though he's not directly hurting you. He's threatening to break your legs if you don't pay up. So I think that could still be construed as violence, because Violence is trying to use the threat of force or actual force to compel someone to do what you want them to do.
So, see, I'm gonna push into this a little bit. One of my problems with, and we'll get into this a little bit regarding violence, is I'm not clear. It's not clear what is okay with capitalism. And if you assume private property and homesteading, people like Hans Hoppe have at least a theory of how to run their society. But people like Chomsky, to me, largely have less of a degree of ways to run their societies without violence. And actually, most of the Marxists are extremely violent.
Most of the anarchists are extremely violent.
Yes. In this regard, the anarchistic right-wing libertarians are actually probably, in this regard, are the most peaceful ones of the anarchists. But in this regard, I don't really know. And Chomsky claims he's not a Marxist. He actually calls Lenin a right-wing phenomenon, as we discussed, which to me borders lines on the absurd when he starts saying things regarding that. But most of the Marxists, they criticize the Catholics and stuff like that, but they themselves are just as guilty of imperialism, carpet bombing, genocide. If anything, if you're comparing the Catholic Church to the Soviet Union, it's going to be a tight balancing act. It's not going to be a firm calculation. And if you use capitalism, let's say these English or Dutch companies as representatives of capitalism. Now, again, some of the defenders of capitalism will dispute that. It's not clear, by the way, that if you compare, some of these capitalistic corporate East Indies type companies, I would actually take being ruled by them over being ruled by Stalin. Now, that's a very tough dispute. If you're really picking three evils there. So in this degree, I think the Chomskyites they don't really have a theory of why they should be pacifistic. And actually, I think the libertarians were the first ones in Rand with their initiation of aggression principle, were the first ones, to me, in the secular sense, develop some sort of general theory on the limiting of use of force. Would you agree on that?
I would. So hold on. What you're saying is if we have three choices, to die at the hands of a Catholic inquisitor, to die at the hands of a Stalinist commissar, or to die at the hands of an East Indian sepoy, it's like, well, I'm just going to quote Keynes, in the long run, we're all dead.
Because that's what the Marxists will use as the representatives of capitalists, the colonial companies. So, but keep going.
Yeah, I mean, here's one of the fundamental problems with the definition. Okay, violence is defined in general, but then there's a distinction between legitimate uses of violence and illegitimate uses of violence. And the problem that ends up arising is you have people who talk past each other, because what determines the just or unjust use of violence is who has ultimate sovereignty. Because obviously murder is the unjustified taking of a human life, and execution is the justified taking of a human life. Expropriation of a factory isn't theft because they stole my surplus labor. But if you're a capitalist, it is theft because I invested my capital into the factory. But it's all self-referential because you're begging the question of who has sovereignty. You first have to demonstrate that you have sovereignty. So within the Christian concept of reality, if you look at the Israelites in the Old Testament, most Christians, I mean, again, you got some liberal ones that would be waffle on this, would argue that Israelites were justified because God had ultimate sovereignty in affairs of everything, and he gave them the license and order to exterminate these tribes. And so in that sense, because God has ultimate sovereignty, God then defines the exceptions. Also, he's the one who defines the legitimate and illegitimate use of violence. Now, everybody has something that stands in for the God of the Old Testament, who justifies violence for them. But the point is, nobody agrees on what that is, they always beg the question because only the Christians have attempted to demonstrate that thing exists, that i.e. God of the Bible exists, whereas the idea of the primacy of property or the primacy of popular assemblies that the socialists have, that's never really been demonstrated. And so it's generally question begging. And it does get really muddy.
I want to talk a little bit about the just war theory. Just war theory was St. Augustine has bits of it, as he's sort of the first one to develop it. Augustine of Hippo. Um, I had to read this. I went to a political science program in college. I had to read this. Actually, it's actually a fairly interesting thing to read. And one of the observations is the general observations. First of all, most wars, based on his list of what requirements to go to war, it says the last resort, don't meet this standard. And second of all, the conduct of the wars themselves, in general, don't really follow his standards. I think you would largely agree on this, correct?
Yeah, I would. I mean, ultimately, just war has the same problem that utilitarianism does. What the heck is the greatest good for the greatest number of people? There's literally no way to know that unless you're God. And the idea that you would have to be reasonably assured that going to war would cause fewer deaths than not going to war is almost impossible to know. There's this sermon by Wesley who points out that once the sword is pulled from the scabbard, nobody knows where it's going to end. And so, case in point, well, the U.S. Civil War and World War I, it's going to be over by Christmas. Oh, we'll just have a short 5-month, escapade. It'll be over by Christmas. No, the American Civil War lasts for 4 years and kills, 750,000 Americans. And the World War I lasts for 4 years and killing, 15 million people. I mean, we don't know where it's going to end, and that's it. And also you end up creating cycles of violence that don't end. So, for example, you might think of Latin America, case in point. Oh, well, there's a dictator. We got to overthrow the dictator. Well, then the war never stops. Mexican Revolution, 1910. Goes on for 20 years until another dictatorship ends it. So, it's like, wow.
Yeah, it's somewhat funny, but like when Ron Paul and Noam Chomsky oftentimes say similar things regarding 9/11, for example. They'll say that, it was American imperialism's fault. And they'll say that they attacked. It was actually a just attack. Actually, that's a very unpopular position to hold, especially in certain circles, but in certain neoconservative circles, which actually I sometimes agree with Christopher Hitchens and neoconservatives, but that's another interesting observation that both of them agree in that regard. And furthermore, to further your pacifistic point, another thing I had to read in college was, and this is really totally depraved, is that if you ever read the book Ordinary Men, which is about the final solution in Poland, okay, it's about, and this was 1943, 1944. This was like the equivalent of like National Guard here in the United States. These were like 50-year-old men. Most of them were, served in World War I, and they were in Poland. They had to carry out this program. No one wanted to do that. No one really wanted to do that. But what the officers told the men was that, and this is pretty savage. I have to laugh. Is that look? Last night the British just bombed 5 of our cities. We have to go kill these people. They just did it to us. You did it to them, which I think that's just right on the boots on the ground cycle of violence, which I find is very interesting. What do you say?
Well, that's exactly the point, right? And to further drill home that point, I don't know if you ever saw the movie The Battle of Algiers, but that's sort of what happens. The Algerians are saying, "Oh, you French security forces are using Gestapo tactics on us," and then the French security forces are like, "Yeah, but you're bombing civilians in cafes and discos." So each one justifies the next escalation in their own mind by referring to a real or imagined a grievance by the enemy. And so you see why turning the other cheek is such an effective method for de-escalating violence, because it does take 2 to tango.
I'll ask one question further along violence. One of the critiques I think you can make is that in some regards, if you have a mouse and a cat, like the mouse has to be pacifistic because it has to be sly, because if its opponent is much stronger. Is this a criticism of Christianity? Is this a kind of first thou shall be last type thing? Is this a...
That's a Christianity most people have made, from the Romans to Machiavelli to Nietzsche, that it's a religion of the weak, that but then you kind of get a contradiction, right? Because on the one hand, people who say Christianity is the religion of the weak will then, say the Catholic Church was a meanie because of its imperial aggression. So you got to make up your mind, like, what is it? But that is certainly one of the criticisms that people have made. But I do find it interesting that the people that put that into the practice the most consistently are the ones that really nobody gets mad at.
Mm-hmm.
They're usually mad at the Christians for not doing it.
Okay, well, the next definition, conflict. So, of all the political science textbook theories I had to read, I actually think René Girard comes up with his mimetic desire theory, which is a triangle of conflict, basically comes up with the best theory of the cause of conflict and the solution to conflict as well. He defines a conflict as a sort of triangle where you have your neighbor, and this can be on a larger level, two states, say, and you have the thing you desire, which is the tip of the triangle. And actually, Slavoj Zizek would actually agree with this formulation as well. But the desire itself is sort of like a mirror, where you desire what your neighbor desires because your neighbor desires it, and so forth. But there's only one Rhineland. There's only one great intellectual position. There's only one, King of France type position. And this triangle is sort of the root of conflict. And he goes through myths, and he goes through all different types of things. Would you agree with his theorization of violence and also the theorization, his solution to violence?
Okay, so yeah, I watched the interview that he had with Robinson on Uncommon Knowledge. Yeah, it was a brilliant interview, and I pretty much, as a working definition, I think he's got a really good one. So yeah, I'll accept that for now. It seems pretty compelling. I don't really have a whole lot to add to that, other than that, again, the idea of suppressing. So, for example, he says that two neighbors desire the same thing, which is why the Bible says, do not covet the property of your neighbor, because that's where conflict comes from, coveting scarce goods. And so right from the beginning, when God gives his law to the children of Israel, he's saying, look, don't do that. So we can already see how it's meant to reduce conflict within a community. Even in the Old Testament, which is perceived as extremely violent, we do see the beginnings of the structures in society that will militate against violent conflict.
Do you agree with his formulation that all order is created by scapegoating, and that the state is sort of a order scapegoating mechanism? Do you agree with his formulation there?
Well, I think he's right, because even if you look at the Christian soteriology, that's how man is restored to God, through scapegoating. In some sense, Christ is scapegoated.
I think this works on a secular level too, because if you think about why did the founders form the United States, to get rid of the monarchs, and in the history of the intermonarchical fights, or this guy, there's lots of different monarchical fights and so forth, but the history of those monarchies, get rid of the one monarchy, then we'll have peace, and you get sort of this, end up with this sort of Hobbesian peace theory, which is quite absurd in my mind. So what don't you agree with the anarchist thinkers I brought, of Chomsky and Hoppe? Not maybe on theology. They're both agnostics or atheists, but sort of in practice and in methods. What don't you agree with them on?
Well, I think the problem with Chomsky and socialists in general is that their desire to level all structures for this level of equality is inherently totalitarian. Because, with Kurt Vonnegut's Handicapper General, where, what was it? They actually made a little short film about that, where strong people are weighed down with heavy lead weights. Smart people have an ear mic that just screams in them when they're going to say something intelligent. And beautiful people wear ugly masks. You can't level everything without a massive use of force, which is why, despite their rhetoric, anarchists always turn into extremely bloodthirsty groups in Russia and Spain and in Mexico. It's just open season on the bourgeoisie and whoever else they don't like. And so I think inherently you have a contradiction. This goes back to actually the point that Engels made in his writings against the anti-authoritarians. A revolution is literally the most authoritarian thing you can do. You're using swords, guns, and cannons to basically kill loads of people to force them to do what you want. And so if you're a consistent anti-authoritarian, you have to reject revolution. And that's a fundamental problem. But it's an even more fundamental problem. You can talk about the problems of scaling a Christian society. You can talk about the problems of scaling a libertarian society. But I don't even know what a socialist society would look like. It's so incoherent. I don't even know if it would have a scaling problem. We haven't even got to the point to talk about a scaling problem. I mean, nobody can give you a non-arbitrary definition of where personal property ends and private property begins. And I've asked a lot of intelligent socialists, and I know friends who've done that too, and we can't get an answer. But that's not the only thing. There's a lot of other, in-house things that they just can't explain in a way that is even conceptually reasonable to even imagine.
And furthermore, I would argue that the sort of anarcho-syndicalists, the left generally, it's and Zizek agrees with this. It's just resentment. It's not that they don't want to get rid of the power. They want the power themselves. It's not that they want some just utopian society. They just want to be in charge. And in this regard, René Girard is dead on.
Well, Nietzsche would say the same thing. It's just resentment.
Yeah, it's just resentment. It's not a desire for a just society. And actually, on the ground, I actually see, the progressive Christians will critique the conservative Christians, but I think the progressive Christians, the ones that both vote and hold office and stuff like that, I think the progressive Christians are in a lot of ways just the flip image of some of the more militant conservative Christians. I mean, they're just full of resentment, and they're just no different than Marxists. Like, where does your followership of Marx end, and where did your following of Christ end? I mean, with someone like Cornel West, I'm not really sure if he's writing a political polemicy or a sermon sometimes. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah, exactly. You see, here the reason why we know the left is motivated by resentment and not justice is because when they have power, they commit atrocities as bad or worse than the right wing they criticize. So, case in point, Russia. As Chomsky said about Lenin in that video, Lenin took over the apparatus of repression more effectively than the Tsar did. And if you look at Makhno in the Ukraine, he just murdered people who couldn't fight back. He murdered Jews, he murdered Mennonites, people that had a lot of money but couldn't fight back. So a classic Viking, you go for the soft targets. And so no, this is just a looting operation. And they go for soft targets, and they commit atrocities as great or worse than the people they criticize, which is the dead giveaway that resentment is the motivating factor.
Yes.
Now, as far as libertarians,
yes,
I would argue that can I conceive of a society that is completely privatized? It's a little more conceivable, but I'm going to have to go with Aristotle on this one. In the Politics, he said that there are two extreme. Well, okay, most societies are a mixture of publicly owned and privately owned good. And we can theoretically imagine a completely privately owned society and a completely publicly owned society, but they're practically impossible for various reasons that he gets into. And while I think a privately owned society is somewhat more plausible than a completely commonly owned society, we still have the same problems. Case in point, when Ed Feser was still a libertarian, he said, what if I homesteaded the air around you to asphyxiate you? So let's say that I dropped some sort of vacuum bell on top of you and suck the air out. I mean, I'm homesteading the air by sucking it out all around you, but then you die of asphyxiation. So did I murder you? I mean, if this is the kind of questions you have to ask in a libertarian society, I think it's almost as inconceivable and incoherent as far left communitarianism.
Yeah. The NAP, okay, so in these rights protection agency, one of the problems I have, one of my critiques of the rights protection agency is, you have sort of the grandmother test is you ask, you define what is this? You're going to say this is a chair. No, this is a state. This is not a new entity. And these rights protection agencies they define, everyone, if you go through a history and you ask, what is this organization called? They'd call it a state. So Singapore has a state. It's not some sort of rights protection agency. Dubai or the Emirates, they do not have anarchist rights protection agencies. And as Hoppe would point, and Hoppe defends these private monarchies. They're just they're states. They're not they're not
States, yeah.
they're not these rights protection agencies would just be states. I mean, you can imagine. I can imagine a society with shareholders, and actually, Hoppe brought these seasetting projects. These seasetting projects are going to start happening, I think, and actually, in some ways, they already have. I think Singapore, to a certain extent, was one of the first ones. Israel, to a certain extent, was kind of like a society like this. You can imagine a society with investors owning and voting rights, but that's like some weird version of capitalist feudalism, almost. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, I mean, one of the common critiques of especially Hoppian libertarianism by the far left is that it's a private state. Private in the sense that what they define as private power, i.e., the money interest, are indistinguishable from the state. And yeah, I think actually that's probably what the Hoppian system would look like. I mean, could it work? Yeah, I think it could. It would be the East India Company, and even the pros and cons of that later. But I think it could work as we saw with the East India Company. But again, when you look at all the Keith Preston once said that listening to ANCAP's debate was like going into a Buddhist temple and listening to them arguing over the ashrams, which is kind of what it is. It's so hair splitting and incoherent that the whole society has to break down at some point. I mean, you can't live a society where you're asking the kinds of questions that the old libertarian Ed Feser was asking.
Yeah, I would agree on this. How does your solution solve the aforementioned problems better than Chomsky or Hoppe and their respective followers? How does your community do this better in a better way than either of them?
I will say that, first of all, so there's really two problems. There's a problem of concept and a problem of scalability. And of course, if you can't get the conceivability first, then scaling is just not even forget about it. You didn't even pass the first stage. As far as being conceivable, well, it's not only conceivable, it's real. We've actually seen it. And the reason I think it works is because, unlike libertarians and socialists, and like Aristotle, we view the family as the fundamental political unit. And we all understand what a family is. We see them all the time. And we organize the family along the principles disclosed in the Bible. And the principles disclosed in the Bible, as you said, are high standards. But you can conceive, but not just conceive, but actually see a society doing it, even if it's a subculture. And I think the reason why it's more plausible, if we're going to leave out any sort of divine help it might have, is it's fundamentally more human. This idea understands what it is to be a human. It's deeply embedded in the sort of tradition of family, and Paul says, honor your father and your mother. He also says, a father should not antagonize his child and make him hate him. Christ said, you being evil, give good gifts to your children. So there's this whole concept that the family is important. I mean, it's not the only important thing, and in fact, against the church and Christ, it's of secondary importance. But it does have, this. I mean, how do you raise kids in a commune or in a private society where both parents are working? You don't. The state raises the kids. Whereas, at least in this society, the kids are inculcated with the values of the society. That's actually another problem. How would these subcultures persist over time? How do you inculcate the values into the next generation? That's assuming you even have one. Given that libertarians and socialists are so egotistical and so fond of birth control, I doubt that even persists for more than a generation or two anyhow, because no one would be having kids. All that would be left would be Christian libertarians and Christian socialists, because none of the others are having children. Now, as far as scalability, hypothetically, if we could envision a scenario like the libertarian novel, And Then There'll Be None, where each subculture gets to get a spaceship and colonize a planet, I could imagine, assuming there's no other intelligent life on that planet, that you could have planet Anabaptists, where they just there's 6 billion Mennonites on the planet, and it works pretty well. I can envision that, even if it's a highly speculative sci-fi scenario, in a way that I couldn't imagine like a spacefaring anarcho-communist society. But in the real world here and now, there's a scalability problem because the standards are too high. for most people to actually live up to.
Yeah, as Keith Preston points out in one of his your talks, is that some anarchist meetings and this is the meeting level of intellectuals end in fights. So 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 just the thinkers can't even agree on what exactly to do. At least Christians have enough people to agree to one teaching there to break away and start a church and start a community.
Well, I think, right, just to make sure, you would agree with me though, right, Tim, that in a scenario as described, and then there will be none, you could envision a whole planet-wide, community like that. But of course, that's an empty planet. There's no other intelligent life there. Here, well, there's a lot of other humans that don't agree with us, and so we just can't outbreed them and take over like we could on that planet.
I think there are problems with this view. First of all, you could argue the United States, the initial agreements to the United States was your tribe or similar tribes. Pennsylvania was founded by the Quakers, and Massachusetts and so forth. And then eventually the system, to a certain extent, broke down, or it became more of the mix between state and private power, or sort of the state. So I'm just going to somewhat decide this debate. I can't imagine, at least plausible. I cannot imagine a community of a union of eagers, so to speak, as Max Stirner would have.
That's incoherent.
I can't imagine that, but I can imagine that. But to a certain extent, the United States sort of was founded like that. Now, again, it grew. It has more people, different groups, and those are all fair criticisms. I 100% agree. But I can't 100% imagine, because I think if you say the problem is sin that affects everyone, it could regenerate in your said community. But that's a side.
That's true. But I think we can moderately agree that the problem of coherency and scalability is much less of a problem for my position than the classic right or left anarchist position.
So I want to get back into just war for a few minutes. Do you think there are any conditions in which Christians should be allowed to go to war? And I'm asking that as a sincere question. Is this an absurd question to ask? Is there any uses where they can? Because you do have those texts in the Bible where it sort of implies that. Now, again, you told me that this was sort of sarcasm on the part of Christ. You only have two swords, but also in Romans you have the state being just. In the Catholics, I think it's I'm going to botch the number on it, but and this is oftentimes
is what you're looking for.
Yeah. This is their justification for becoming the state. The state is there for the good. You should be afraid of the state because if it's a good state and so forth, it's never motivation for you for the good. What would you say on that?
Well, I would say it's a good question in light of the fact that church history has been retconned, as I said. For the first 300 years of the church, everybody acted like, for lack of a better word, Amish in the regards of dealing with the state. In regards of dealing with the state, they all acted like the Amish.
Yeah, but I'm just going to push back. But one of the reasons they had to operate like that, because there was, and this is sort of the Nietzschean critique of Christianity, they had to operate like that because you can't just, a group of Christians couldn't take on the Roman legions. I mean,
I find that to be a very unconvincing argument, because that's exactly what the Jews did. They had no political power, but they turned to terrorism under the Sicarii. And we see that today with Islamists. They have really very little political power, and active violence is generally, well, it is suicidal. They just embrace the contradiction of it, and they still resort to it. And furthermore,
it depends on what you mean by winning, though. I mean, and to a certain extent, the Viet Cong won the Vietnam War, but they won it at a great cost.
No, I would agree, but what I'm saying is just because you seem to be very weak at the moment, that doesn't mean that that's the driving factor for why you behave a certain way. And furthermore, I think you and I would agree on the principle of just, goodwill, that someone's self-described testimony of why they do what they do should be accepted until we have good reason to believe otherwise. I think you'd agree to that, right?
I would say fair enough. But I do think that Christians have problems when they get the power, when they have the power. I think this
Well, I would agree.
sort of occurred in the Protestant Reformation as well. That once the Catholic Church went away, Luther got a lot less radical. Would you agree? A lot of these
Well,
Protestants
actually,
got
what made Luther less radical was when the Anabaptists started taking Luther to his logical conclusion. You see, Luther said, well, we need to take the Bible all the way seriously through and apply it to every aspect of life. And then when they're like, yeah, so let's beat our swords into plowshares. Let's not have an infant baptism. Let's start living like Acts. Luther's like, whoa, stop the brakes, man. I didn't want to go back to the book of Acts. I mean, give me a break. I just want to go back to the Roman Empire. I mean, that's pretty much what it ended up turning out to be. So, yeah, that's the point, is that Luther didn't like that they took it all the way through. Neither did Zwingli. What Zwingli was like, they're like, no, Zwingli, you're too slow. You got to start reforming faster. And you got to go all the way, anything that can't be derived from the scripture should be gotten rid of. And he's like, whoa, well, that's too fast, guys. You can't do that. Then he threw him in prison and killed him. But I like your point about the state, because I think what a lot of people would understand is that the state corrupts things. And so, if socialists today will say, oh, well, state socialism, hashtag not real socialism, because it did terrible things I don't like, or like, the East India Company, or like,
hashtag state capitalism.
State capitalism. But here's the thing. If you're going to make that argument, then it's obviously the case that that's state Christianity, and that's the problem. I mean, that would be the fair thing to say, but they're not going to do that. But I think everybody can agree that whatever value system you have, the use of monopolistic violence corrupts it. Whether it's socialism, the libertarian NAP, or libertarianism just with free markets, and then Christianity. The use of that kind of power intrinsically corrupts it, which of course is why Roger Williams in the United States, now he's a Baptist, he sought separation of church and state for that reason. So that it was, people like to think that, oh, we want to keep the state free from religious influence, but the real motivation was to keep the church from being corrupted by the more mundane demands of the state and the temptations of power.
Yes, the state. This is where I think people like Hoppe. Well, actually, even you go take it Nietzsche. I gave you a quote by Nietzsche from Beyond Good and Evil. I think that's, he who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. And if thou gaze long enough into the abyss will also gaze into thee. I think people who join the state and become the state get corrupted, and they're asked to make very tough decisions. And I think, actually, I know you don't like Rod Dreher, but not that you don't like him, but you don't like everything
I
he says.
find him annoying.
Yeah. I actually do think that to a certain extent, maybe not in the United States, but I think clearly in Western Europe, and actually this is happening now in the United Kingdom, that Christians who want to follow Christ will start getting more public persecution to a certain extent. Maybe not full on East Germany type, but it's gonna be coming. I think you would agree to that, correct?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's already ministers in prison for condemning homosexuality in Western Europe.
So yeah, so I think the state power does corrupt it. So I think that in that regard, Hoppe, Chomsky, and Christ and Paul would all agree on that. And actually, another thing that Chomsky said, and this is another problem with military things, is and this is you said you couldn't listen to the whole thing because he's a little hard to listen because he's a bit of a moralizer. But the problem is the victor, right? So what did the United States learn from World War II? Oh, mobilize your whole population, build large nuclear weapons. That wins the war, right? I mean, so next time that another one wants to beat the United States, you just got to be bigger than the United States. I mean, it's almost like I think that was discussed in this sort of the Orwell thing that you gave me as well. So the problem is the victor. To a certain degree, in the short term, going to war to stop a war, the war to end all wars is a sort of absurd thing.
Yeah,
it's totally absurd. I think in this regard, the Bible is dead on.
Well, yeah, because the lesson that's invariably learned is this is what works. There was I don't remember exactly where it is, but in the first volume of the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn describes this idea that Russia learned all the wrong lessons, right? He says that when you lose a war, you gain freedom. And he mentioned how when Sweden lost the Great Northern War, when Charles XII and his imperialist ambitions were defeated, that's when the crown was discredited, and Sweden then the Swedish people then began to gain rights from the expense of the king. And so I don't know. Obviously, losing a war doesn't automatically mean you're going to get freedom, because the Russians sure didn't get freedom losing World War I. But the point is, yeah, if you win a war, all it does is reward aggression and such. And so the idea that, well, case in point, right? Look at how Victor Davis Hanson looks at things, right? He's like, oh, well, the lesson of World War I is we just didn't beat the Germans hard enough. We didn't beat them badly enough. And the lesson of World War II is you just got to beat everybody into oblivion. The fact is, you can't do that to everyone, because then everybody's going to hate you and they'll dogpile you and destroy you, which is what's happened historically when that strategy's been pursued.
Yeah, in the United States, hopefully, in the United States, that's going to start happening. The United States can't continuously outspend China, Russia, Brazil, Western Europe by a factor of 3 in military spending indefinitely. Maybe it can, maybe it can't. Maybe America is exceptional, but America is going to end up in the same case that Britain, Spain, Holy Roman Empire. It's going to go the same way. Agreed?
Oh yeah. Like when the Spanish-American War took place, and the Anti-Imperialist League wrote "The Spanish Conquest of America."
Yeah.
Or no, I think it was the essay was entitled "The Conquest of America by Spain," and it was saying that we were committing all the same mistakes that the Spanish Empire had committed, and in 1898, Spain was a backwater and a shell of its former self.
Okay, so one final line of questioning before we wrap this up here, but and this relates to assemblies. What is the argument against assemblies for like the administration? What is the argument for Christians not to serve on like city councils and things like that? I'm not talking about anything to do with police or military with the capital M or P, but city councils, those sorts of things. Now you could argue they do deal with police, and they do, but what's the argument against assemblies? If I understand correctly, there are some groups that have more. You're allowed to do more regarding the state than other groups. If I understand that correctly.
Yeah, it's on a spectrum. So, like for example, the Quakers are far more tolerant of their members serving in lower level functions of the government, and it also then begs the question: well, what if there's a otherwise benign profession, like say firefighting, which could be privatized, but for whatever reason is currently provided by the state? What does that mean for the Christian? Can they serve in the local fire department even if it's a state? That's been a debate that's been going on at least in America for a while. But the general argument would be that when Christ talks about there are the kingdoms of the world, right? We see he's tempted on the mountain, and Satan says, "I can give you all these kingdoms of the world." And his own kingdom. So he says, right, you can't serve God and mammon, you can't serve 2 masters. Sort of riffing off that idea, you can't serve 2 masters. You either serve, you serve Christ or bust. I mean, that's the way he sets it up. It's him and everything else. And so everything else includes everything else, which would be the state. And furthermore, the very means by which it maintains its authority is fundamentally, you cannot live the gospel life and do that. Like, that's the point. If you were to actually, be a part of that apparatus, you would be forced at times to do what you have to violate your conscience. And then, in Roman times, that probably mean you get killed if you didn't do it. So I'm glad we're beyond that level of barbarism. But fundamentally, in a nutshell, you would be a part of a system that would force you to do things contrary to the gospel.
All righty. Fair enough.
So, thanks for coming on, Tim. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.